She had spent 19 years convinced she had married the wrong man. 19 years of sitting across the breakfast table from a quiet man in a worn flannel shirt, watching him sip his coffee, and quietly aching for the life she felt she had been cheated out of. A bigger house. A newer car. A husband other women would envy. And on a cold Tuesday morning in March, Rebecca Whittaker finally did something about it. She signed the divorce papers, slid them across the table without looking up, and walked out of the only home she had known for 2 decades, telling herself she was finally free. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that in just 11 days, that single decision would become the most expensive mistake of her entire life. To everyone who knew them, the ending of the Whittaker marriage was the least surprising thing in the world. Friends had watched it coming for years. They saw the way Rebecca's smile tightened when Daniel pulled up in that dented old pickup truck. They heard the way her voice changed when she introduced him at dinner parties, the small apology hidden inside every sentence. "He works with his hands," she would say. "He does a little of this, a little of that." Daniel Whittaker was a man who seemed to have made peace with having nothing, and to Rebecca, after 19 years, that peace had started to feel like a cage. She wanted more. She had always wanted more. And she had finally found a man who promised to give it to her. His name was Marcus Devlin, and he was everything Daniel was not. Where Daniel was quiet, Marcus was charming. Where Daniel drove a truck that was older than their marriage, Marcus drove a car that cost more than the Whittaker house. He was a commercial real estate broker, the kind of man who spoke in millions and shook hands like he was closing a deal even when he wasn't. To Rebecca, he was a door opening onto the life she had always believed she deserved. So when Marcus invited her to join him for the biggest meeting of his career, in the lobby of the tallest tower in Dallas, Rebecca said yes without hesitation. She wore her best dress. She held her head high. And she had no idea she was walking straight into the truth. Her heels echoed across the polished marble floor as she stepped inside. The ceiling rose far above her, all glass and steel and quiet, enormous wealth. This was the world she had wanted to belong to her whole life, and for one perfect moment, she felt like she finally did. Then she looked up. There, carved into the stone wall above the front desk, large enough to fill the entire lobby, was a single word. A name. She read it once, and her mind refused to understand it. She read it again, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The name on the tallest building in the city, the name on the very empire Marcus had spent his entire career trying to break into, was a name she had carried for 19 years and signed away just 11 days ago. The name was Whittaker. What Rebecca learned in that lobby would not simply end her new relationship before it had even truly begun. It would tear open a secret that her quiet, unremarkable husband had guarded with absolute discipline for more than 30 years. It would reveal that the broken man she had pitied, apologized for, and finally thrown away was not broke at all. The man in the dented pickup truck, the man who ate the same breakfast at the same diner every single morning, the man she believed had given her nothing, was worth $5 billion. $5 billion. Not in rumors. Not in some far-off fortune she could never touch. In steel, in glass, in land, in the very skyline of an entire city. This is the story of how one woman walked away from everything, 11 short days too soon, but to understand the size of what Rebecca lost that day, you first have to understand the man she thought she knew. Because almost nothing about Daniel Whitaker was what it appeared to be. The truck was a choice. The quiet was a choice. The simple house and the worn flannel and the small, careful life, every single piece of it was a choice, built deliberately, year by year, over decades. Daniel had spent his entire adult life constructing two different men. One was the husband Rebecca saw every morning. The other was a figure so powerful that senators returned his calls and the richest developers in Texas were afraid of his silence. For 19 years, those two men lived inside the same body, and Rebecca shared a bed with both of them without ever knowing the second one existed. And that raises the questions that sit at the very heart of this story. The first is the most obvious one. How does a man hide a $5 billion fortune from the woman who slept beside him for 19 years, not for a month, not for a year, but for nearly 2 decades, without a single slip? The second question is far harder to answer, and far harder to forgive. Why? Why would any man choose to live as though he had nothing, to wear the same boots until they fell apart, to let his own wife pity him at dinner parties, when he could have given her everything she ever asked for with the stroke of a pen? And the third question is the one that haunts everyone who ever learned the truth. What truly happened in those 11 days? Before we go any further into this story, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is not really a story about money at all. It is a story about pride, and about loyalty, and about the quiet, terrible cost of believing you already know exactly who someone is. It is a story about a test that one man spent 30 years preparing, and a woman who failed it by 11 days. So settle in, because to find the truth about Daniel Whitaker, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning, long before the towers, long before the billions, to a boy who learned the cruelest lesson money has ever taught. Daniel Whitaker was born in a small town an hour outside Fort Worth, in a house his family did not own and could barely afford to rent. It was the kind of town that does not appear on most maps: a single main street, a feed store, a church, and a diner where the same men drank the same coffee every morning of their lives. The Whitakers were not the poorest family in that town, but they were close, and Daniel grew up understanding the difference between wanting and having long before he had the words for it. He wore his older cousin's hand-me-downs. He learned to make a single pair of boots last for years. And through all of it, he watched his father work himself half to death, certain that hard work was a kind of currency the world would one day pay back. Daniel's father was the most honest man he ever knew, and Daniel would spend the rest of his life trying to decide whether that honesty had been a strength or a weakness. The man believed, with something close to religion, that if you kept your word and worked your land and never took what was not yours, the world would eventually be fair to you. He said it so often that young Daniel could recite it. Be a man of your word, son, and let your word be your wealth. For years Daniel believed it completely. He believed it watching his father rise before dawn. He believed it watching him shake hands on deals sealed with nothing but a promise. And he went on believing it right up until the day he watched that same belief get a proud man destroyed. The land had been in the Whitaker family for 3 generations. It was not much by the standards of the wide Texas country around it, a few dozen acres, some of it good, most of it stubborn, but it was theirs, and it carried their name, and Daniel's father loved it the way a man loves the thing that made him. When a development company came through, buying up parcels for a project that would never quite materialize, they came to the Whitaker place with smiles and paperwork and the easy confidence of men who had done this 100 times. They explained the contract in friendly terms. They assured Daniel's father, again and again, that everything was fair. And Daniel's father, a man of his word who assumed every other man was the same, signed where they pointed without ever paying for his own lawyer to read it. He should have. Buried in the language of that contract, in clauses no honest handshake would ever have allowed, was a trap. The price the company actually paid was a fraction of what they had promised in conversation, and a series of conditions and easements stripped away rights the family had held for generations. By the time Daniel's father understood what he had truly signed, the land was gone, the money was a fraction of what he had counted on, and the men in the good suits had moved on to the next town, the next handshake, the next honest man. There was no fraud the law would recognize. There was only the cold, legal truth that a richer party had outmaneuvered a poorer one, and that being poorer was its own kind of guilt in a courtroom. Daniel was 16 the night his father came home with empty hands. He remembered every detail of it for the rest of his life. He remembered the silence of the truck pulling into the drive far too slowly. He remembered the screen door, and the way his father set his hat on the table with a gentleness that frightened him more than shouting ever could. And then he watched the strongest man he knew sit down at the kitchen table, put his face in his hands, and weep. It was the first and only time Daniel ever saw his father cry. And in that moment, the religion the man had raised him on, work hard, keep your word, and the world will be fair, shattered in Daniel's chest and never fully formed again. He understood, all at once, that the world was not fair. The world belonged to whoever had the money. That single night carved two promises into Daniel Whitaker, and he would spend the next 40 years keeping both of them. The first promise was simple, and any wounded boy might have made it. He swore that he would never be powerless again. He swore that one day he would have so much money, and understand it so completely, that no man in a good suit could ever take anything from him or from anyone he loved. He would learn the language those men spoke, the language of contracts and clauses and leverage, and he would learn it better than they knew it themselves. He would never, ever again be the honest man on the wrong side of the table. From that night forward, every choice Daniel made bent quietly toward that single, burning purpose. But it was the second promise that would shape his heart and ultimately his marriage, far more than the first. Daniel had begun to notice something about money even before he had any of his own. He had watched a neighbor come into a small inheritance and seen, almost overnight, how the man was suddenly surrounded by friends he had never had. He had watched relatives quarrel over the scraps of an aunt's estate as though love had a price written on it. And he had watched, painfully, the way some of the same people in town who had pitied the Whitakers when the land was lost would surely have praised them had they been rich instead. Money, Daniel realized, did not just buy things. It bought lies. It put a price tag on every smile aimed your way. So Daniel made his second vow, and it was the strange and lonely one. He swore that if he ever became wealthy, no one would ever know. He would build his fortune in silence, hide it behind plain clothes and an ordinary life, and in doing so he would create for himself the one thing money usually destroys, the ability to know who truly loved him. A man with visible wealth, Daniel reasoned, can never be sure of anyone. But a man who appears to have nothing, and is loved anyway, can be certain that the love is real. It was, in its way, a beautiful idea, born of a deep and understandable wound. It was also the seed of a tragedy that would take 30 years to bloom. But Daniel could not see that yet. He could only see a way to never be fooled again. He left home as soon as he was able, with little more than those 2 promises and a stubbornness that bordered on stone. He worked every job a young man could find. He swung a hammer on construction sites and learned how buildings were actually put together. He kept the books for a small hardware store and learned how money actually moved. He read everything he could find about property, about contracts, about the men who had built fortunes out of nothing but land and patience. While other young men his age spent their wages on cars and Saturday nights, Daniel spent his on nothing at all, saving every dollar he did not absolutely need, sleeping in rooms barely larger than a closet, eating the cheapest food he could stand. He was not living poor because he had to. He was living poor on purpose, gathering himself like a slingshot pulled slowly back. By his middle 20s, Daniel understood real estate the way a musician understands a song. He could look at a forgotten lot, a tired building, a stretch of cheap land on the wrong side of a growing town, and see not what it was but what it would become. He understood that the men who got rich in property were rarely the ones who built the towers, they were the ones who owned the dirt the towers would one day rise from. And so he waited, and he watched, and he learned the patient art of buying what no one else wanted in places everyone else had written off, knowing that cities grow, that roads get built, and that today's nothing is tomorrow's everything to the man with the foresight and the nerve to wait. His first real deal came when he was 27. It was a parcel of land on the far edge of a town that everyone agreed was going nowhere, scrubby, awkwardly shaped, passed over by every serious buyer for a decade. But Daniel had heard something, the kind of thing a quiet young man hears when he spends more time listening than talking. He had heard that a new highway interchange was being planned, years out, that would one day put that forgotten parcel directly in the path of the town's growth. He scraped together everything he had saved, borrowed what little more he dared, and bought the land for almost nothing while the seller laughed at the foolish young man paying good money for bad dirt. And then, for the first time in his life, Daniel held something that was truly, entirely his. For 3 years, nothing happened, and Daniel learned the hardest lesson of his trade, that patience is not waiting, but enduring. He held the land through doubt, through the temptation to sell at the smallest profit, through the quiet voices that told him he had been a fool. And then the highway plans became public. Suddenly the forgotten parcel was the most valuable piece of ground for miles, sitting squarely where the new growth would have to flow. Developers who had laughed at him came knocking, and Daniel, who had taught himself their language, did not sell to the first or the loudest. He waited again, let them bid against one another, and finally sold for many, many times what he had paid. The boy whose father had been robbed across a kitchen table had just beaten the men in the good suits at their own game. It would have been the happiest moment of his young life, if not for the woman who was beside him for it. We will not use her name, because she does not deserve to be remembered, but at the time Daniel loved her more than he had ever loved anything. She had come into his life during the lean years, when he had nothing to show but ambition, and that, he believed, was the proof that her love was true. He broke his own second vow for her. He told her everything, the plan, the patience, the fortune he was certain he could build. He let her see all of it, held nothing back, because he was sure, finally, that he had found someone who loved the man and not the money. He was about to learn how wrong a hopeful heart can be. When the money from that first deal came in, she changed, though so slowly that Daniel told himself he was imagining it. She spoke more and more about the things they would buy, the life they would lead, the people they would finally be. And Daniel, drunk on his own success and on her sudden warmth, made the boldest decision of his young career. He took nearly everything he had earned and poured it into a second deal, far larger and far riskier than the first, a gamble that would either double his fortune in a single stroke or wipe him back to nothing. For a few months, it teetered on the edge of disaster. A financing deal fell through. A buyer walked away. And word got around, as word does, that the young man who had gotten rich so fast might be about to lose it all just as quickly. That was when she vanished. Not with a fight, not with the dignity of an honest goodbye, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who had simply been waiting to see which way the money fell. When it looked as though Daniel might lose everything, she was gone within weeks, and she did not leave empty-handed. She took the gifts, the money he had given her, the small fortune he had foolishly placed in joint reach, and she took something far more valuable that he would never get back, the last piece of his ability to trust. Daniel came home one evening to a half-empty apartment and a short note that said almost nothing, and he understood, standing there in the silence, that everything his second vow had tried to protect him from had happened anyway, because he had let it. The cruelest part was what came next. The very deal that had frightened her away recovered. It took another year, and more patience than Daniel thought he had left in him, but the larger gamble eventually paid off even more handsomely than the first. Had she only stayed a little longer, had she only loved him through the lean stretch, she would have shared in a fortune. Instead she had run at the first sign of an empty account and missed it entirely. Daniel noted the bitter symmetry of it and filed it away in the cold place inside him where the lesson now lived permanently. He had been right about money all along. He had simply been foolish enough, for love, to forget what he knew. He swore, this time with no softness left in him, that he would never forget again. From that wound, the real Daniel Whitaker was born, the one Rebecca would one day marry without ever meeting. He took his two old promises and fused them into a single, unbreakable law. He would build an empire, and he would make it invisible. He created a private holding company with a name that pointed at no one, a name chosen precisely because it meant nothing and revealed nothing, Meridian Holdings. Behind that name he would buy and build and accumulate, deal after deal, year after year, while the man named Daniel Whitaker went on appearing, to the whole world, like an ordinary fellow of ordinary means. The fortune would be real. Poverty would be the costume. And only Daniel, and one other man, would ever know the difference. That other man was Walter Boyd. Daniel met him in the aftermath of the betrayal, a careful, unglamorous lawyer with a reputation for absolute discretion and absolutely no interest in the spotlight. Where other attorneys chased famous clients and bigger names, Walter preferred the quiet work of protecting what his clients had already built. Daniel tested him the way he now tested everyone, slowly and from a distance, and over years Walter earned the only thing Daniel had left to give, his trust. It was Walter who designed the structures that would hide the empire, the trusts and the layered companies and the careful walls that kept Meridian's true owner all but impossible to find. And it was Walter, alone among all the people in Daniel's life, who would always know exactly how much Daniel Whitaker was really worth. The number, with each passing year, climbed higher into the dark. The empire grew the way Daniel did everything, patiently and out of sight. He bought tired buildings in neighborhoods everyone had given up on, holding them until the city's slow tide of growth turned them golden. He bought land on the edges of expanding suburbs, vast banks of it, and simply waited as the roads and the rooftops marched toward him. He bought a struggling shopping center here, a half-empty office tower there, each one a single brushstroke in a painting only he could see. He almost never sold. He let the holdings compound on one another, rents feeding new purchases, purchases feeding new rents, the whole machine turning quietly behind the harmless name of Meridian. And through it all, the man who controlled it drove an old truck, wore the same few jackets, and never once let the world catch even a glimpse of the giant he had become. Among the deals that built the empire, there was one that the few men who knew the truth still spoke of with something close to awe. Over the better part of a decade, Daniel had quietly assembled an entire downtown block, buying it one small parcel at a time, a corner shop here, a tired warehouse there, a parking lot, a shuttered theater, never letting any single seller understand that the same patient hand was behind every purchase. He used different companies for each, layered through Meridian so carefully that not even the city planners realized one owner now held the whole block. And then, when the last parcel finally fell into place, he held the assembled land and waited, as he always waited, while the city grew toward it. When he at last allowed a tower to rise there, it was worth many times what the scattered pieces had cost. There were harder years, 2 years Daniel carried entirely alone. When the markets turned and credit froze and lesser men were ruined overnight, Daniel sat in his locked office doing math by lamplight, staring down losses large enough to frighten any man. He could tell no one. That was the price of the secret he had chosen. He could not share the fear with his wife, because his wife did not know there was anything to fear. She slept soundly down the hall, believing they had nothing much to lose. So Daniel weathered the worst storms of his career in complete silence, with only Walter Boyd on the other end of a quiet phone, and each time the empire survived, it survived a little stronger, and he tested the people around him constantly, though almost none of them ever knew it. He would mention, off-handedly, a struggle he was not actually having, just to see who pulled away and who leaned in. He would appear poorer than he was to a new partner, then watch closely how he was treated. He kept the people who treated the plain man with respect, and he quietly let go of the ones who only warmed when they smelled money. Over the years, this winnowing left him with a small circle of fiercely loyal people, every one of whom had passed a test they never knew they were taking. It was, in its way, a brilliant system. It was also a deeply lonely one. For Daniel had built a life in which the only love he could trust was love offered to a man who appeared to have nothing at all. Money never changed the way Daniel lived, and that, more than the fortune itself, was what made him a mystery even to the few who knew the truth. He could have owned a dozen mansions, he kept the modest house. He could have flown anywhere on earth in an instant, he drove the old truck to the same diner. Walter Boyd once asked him, plainly, why a man worth what Daniel was chose to live as though he were worth nothing at all. Daniel thought about it for a long moment and answered that the things money bought had never been the things he wanted. He had wanted, his whole life, only two things: to never again be powerless, and to be loved by someone who did not know or care what he was worth. He had achieved the first completely. The second, he admitted quietly, he was still waiting on. And so the years rolled on, and the giant in the old truck grew quietly larger, and the loneliness grew quietly larger right alongside it. Daniel had everything a man could buy and almost no one to share a single piece of it with. He had proven, 100 times over, that the men in the good suits could never take anything from him again. He had kept the first promise he made as a boy completely and absolutely. But the second promise, the one about love, the one about finding the person who would care for him with his pockets turned out and empty, remained stubbornly unkept, year after year after year, while the fortune climbed higher into the dark and the man who owned it went on eating his eggs alone. By the time Daniel Whitaker was in his late 30s, he was, by any honest measure, an extraordinarily rich man. And by any honest measure, no one in his daily life had the faintest idea. He had become so practiced at the disguise that it was no longer a disguise at all, it was simply how he lived. He genuinely loved the old truck. He genuinely preferred the quiet diner to any restaurant money could open for him. The plainness that had begun as a strategy had become, over the years, something close to a peace. He had begun as a strategy had become, over the years, something close to a peace. He had everything a man could want, and almost no one to share it with, because the one time he had let someone close, she had proven his deepest fear true. So he kept the door locked, on the office and on his heart, and he told himself that solitude was a fair price for safety. And then, one ordinary summer morning, in a diner he happened to own, he met a waitress named Rebecca. She did not know who he was, and that was the whole of it. To Rebecca, he was simply a quiet man in a worn jacket who came in 3 mornings running and ordered the same thing each time, eggs and black coffee, and left a fair tip and a kind word and nothing more. She was young then, saving for a future she had not yet figured out, working long shifts with a tired smile that Daniel found himself watching from his corner booth. What drew him in was not her beauty, though she was beautiful. It was her ordinariness, the blessed, unremarkable fact that she treated him as exactly what he appeared to be, a man of no particular importance, deserving of no particular treatment. For the first time since the betrayal that had remade him, Daniel Whitaker felt, in the presence of another person, completely safe. He courted her the way he courted everything in his life, slowly and with infinite care. He did not sweep her off her feet with extravagance, because he had no intention of letting extravagance into the equation at all. He took her to small places. He gave small, thoughtful gifts. He listened, truly listened, in a way she would later say no man ever had before or since. And over months, then years, Rebecca fell in love, not with a fortune she could not see, but with the steady, gentle, attentive man in front of her. To her, Daniel was proof that the flashier men of her past had been the wrong dream all along. Here was a man with nothing much to offer but himself, and somehow that felt like more than all the empty charm she had known. She did not realize she was being tested. She only knew she was, at last, happy. When Daniel finally proposed, he did it with a modest ring he had chosen himself, sized for a working man's budget, and he watched her face with a quiet intensity she mistook for nervousness. It was not nervousness. It was the held breath of a man watching the most important test of his life. He needed to know whether her face would fall at the smallness of the ring, whether some flicker of disappointment would cross it. It did not. Rebecca cried and said yes and held the modest ring like a treasure, and in that moment Daniel allowed himself, for the first time in over a decade, to believe. He believed he had found the impossible thing, a person who loved the man and not the money, because she did not even know the money existed. She had passed. She had no idea there had been anything to pass. There was, though, one small strangeness in those final weeks before the wedding, a moment Rebecca would not think about again for nearly 20 years. Daniel's quiet friend, the lawyer Walter Boyd, asked her to sit down and sign a handful of legal documents. Daniel apologized for it, almost sheepish, explaining that it was nothing but routine paperwork, the kind of thing his careful lawyer always insisted on. Rebecca did not read it closely, she had no reason to. She was marrying a man who, as far as she could see, owned little more than a truck and a contented heart. She laughed as she signed her name across the pages, joking that there was hardly a fortune in the world worth all this protecting. Walter Boyd did not laugh. He simply gathered the papers, thanked her, and slid them into a folder that would sit forgotten until the day it would decide the entire course of her life. And so they were married, two people standing at an altar with two completely different understandings of what was being joined. For the first several years, none of the differences mattered. They were genuinely, deeply happy. They lived in a modest house in a modest neighborhood, and if Daniel sometimes disappeared for a few hours in the mornings and returned with the calm of a man who had done a hard day's work, Rebecca learned not to ask too much about it. There was the office at the back of the house that was always locked, the one room Daniel asked her, gently but firmly, never to enter. There were the occasional visits from Walter Boyd, the two men murmuring over papers in low voices about things she could not follow. Small mysteries, all of them. But love has a way of smoothing over small mysteries, and for a while, love did. For the first decade, the things Rebecca did not have simply did not seem to matter. She and Daniel were young, and in love, and the small house felt full of it. But love, left alone with the years, has a way of growing quiet, and into that quiet a different voice slowly begins to speak. It started small, almost too small to notice. A close friend bought a lake house, and Rebecca came home that evening unusually silent, staring out the window long after she should have gone to bed. A neighbor pulled into the driveway across the street in a gleaming new truck, and Rebecca found herself watching it with an ache she could not quite name. She began, without ever deciding to keep a private ledger in her mind, a running list of everything other people had that she did not. And the longer the list grew, the heavier the quiet in the Whitaker house became. What troubled Rebecca most, as the years wore on, was not the absence of money itself. It was Daniel's terrible calm about it. He never seemed to want more. He never complained, never schemed, never lay awake at night the way she did, doing the math on a life that always seemed to come up short. When she pushed him to ask for more work, to chase something bigger, to do anything at all to climb the way other men climbed, he would only give her that maddening, gentle smile and tell her, simply, that they had enough. Enough. The word made her want to scream. To Rebecca, Daniel's contentment had stopped looking like wisdom somewhere along the way and started looking like surrender, as though her husband had quietly decided, on her behalf, that this small life was the best she would ever be permitted to have. The hardest part was that Rebecca was not, by nature, a cruel or shallow woman. She loved her husband, she would have told you so honestly, even in those difficult years. But she had grown up watching her own family scrape and worry, and somewhere deep inside her lived a fear of ending up exactly where she had started, invisible, overlooked, less than. To Rebecca, money had never been about luxury. It had been about being seen, about mattering, about proving to a world that had once looked past her that she was someone after all. And every year that Daniel smiled and said they had enough, she heard, beneath it, the quiet sentence she feared most. You will always be less than the people around you. And slowly, without ever meaning to, she began to resent the man who seemed so at peace with that. The dinner parties grew harder to bear, year by year. Rebecca's friends had married men who talked about promotions and investments and second homes, and over the years those men had pulled steadily ahead while Daniel stayed exactly where he was, or where he appeared to be. She began to introduce him with that small apology hidden in her voice, watching her friends exchange glances they thought she could not see. She began, on the worst nights, to leave him at home. And then came the evening she would later look back on as the true beginning of the end, though she did not recognize it as anything at the time. At a charity fundraiser she had practically begged Daniel to attend. Something happened that she could not explain, and would spend years trying to forget. An older gentleman in a beautiful, expensive suit crossed the entire crowded room, his eyes fixed on Daniel with an expression Rebecca had never seen anyone direct at her husband before. He took Daniel's hand in both of his, leaned in close, and said, with a warmth that bordered on reverence, that it was an honor, sir. An honor. Rebecca stood there blinking, certain she had misheard, certain it must be a case of mistaken identity, some confusion, some other man this stranger had meant to greet. She laughed it off in the car on the way home, teasing Daniel that he must have a secret twin somewhere, someone important. Daniel only smiled that quiet smile and said nothing at all, his eyes on the dark road ahead. Rebecca let it go. She always let it go. It was so much easier than asking the question that might have changed everything. There were the anniversaries, too, which year after year became small monuments to Rebecca's disappointment. She would let herself hope, in the days before, that this would be the year Daniel surprised her, a real trip, a real gift, some grand gesture that would prove he saw the life she wanted and wanted it for her too. And year after year, Daniel would instead cook her favorite meal himself, or take her to the quiet diner where they had met, or give her some small handmade thing chosen with obvious care. To another woman it might have been romance. To Rebecca, aching to be more than she was, it felt only like confirmation that her husband had no bigger dreams for her than the small ones he already had. She would smile and thank him and feel, underneath the smile, the slow cold settling of a hope deferred one more year. The weekend at her friend's new lake house was perhaps the worst of them. Rebecca had looked forward to it for weeks, and from the moment they arrived she felt the distance between her life and the lives around her like a physical weight. The other couples talked of renovations and vacations and the boats they were thinking of buying, and Daniel sat among them in his plain shirt, content and quiet, contributing little, while Rebecca watched her friend's polite eyes slide over him. On the drive home she finally broke, telling him through tears that she was tired, so tired, of being the poor ones, the small ones, the couple everyone secretly pitied. Daniel listened, and was gentle, and told her again that they had enough. And Rebecca turned her face to the window and decided, somewhere deep inside, that she would not feel that way forever. Holidays were their own particular ache. Rebecca would watch other families post photographs from far-off places, from cruises and ski lodges and beaches, while the Whitakers spent another quiet Christmas at home, Daniel content by the fire, Rebecca smiling for photographs she did not want to take. She told herself that one day it would be different, that one day they would have the kind of life worth photographing. But the years passed and life did not come, and somewhere along the way Rebecca stopped believing it ever would. She did not know that her husband could have given her any holiday she could dream of, in any corner of the world, with a single phone call. She only knew that he never did, and she built, on that single fact, an entire case against him that she would spend 19 years quietly prosecuting in her heart. Once, only once, Rebecca lingered at the door of the locked office. Daniel had stepped out, and the house was empty, and she stood there with her hand resting on the cool knob, seized by a sudden, nameless need to know what her husband kept inside that he would not share even with her. She told herself it was foolish. What could a man like Daniel possibly be hiding? Old tax papers, perhaps, or the sad mementos of some private grief. The door was locked, as it always was. And after a long moment she took her hand away, faintly ashamed of her own curiosity, and never tried again. She would think back on that moment many times in the years to come. The truth of her entire life had been waiting on the other side of that door, and she had been one turnkey away from it, and had simply walked away. And there were the quiet kindnesses she never thought to question. The way a struggling neighbor's mortgage was somehow, mysteriously, brought current. The way a sick child in their old congregation received care no one could quite explain the funding of. The way certain families in town who fell on hard times seemed to recover with a speed that surprised everyone but the man in the old truck. Rebecca noticed these things the way one notices weather, in passing, without ever connecting them to her own husband, who claimed they had barely enough for themselves. Had she thought about it even once, truly thought about it, the arithmetic would never have added up. But Rebecca had long ago stopped expecting her husband to be the source of anything large, and so she never did the math that would have revealed the giant standing quietly beside her. There were other moments like it, scattered across the years, small impossible details that did not fit the man she thought she had married. A bank manager who treated Daniel with a deference that made no sense for an odd-job man. A phone call Daniel took in another room, his voice dropping into a register of quiet command she had never heard him use with her. The way certain powerful-looking people, at certain events, seemed to know exactly who he was while pretending, at his subtle signal, that they did not. Any one of these, looked at squarely, might have unraveled the whole secret. But Rebecca never looked at them squarely. She was a woman who had already decided what her life was, small, disappointing, beneath what she deserved, and the truth, when it brushed against her, simply did not fit the story she had chosen to believe. So again and again, she noticed. And again, she chose to forget. It was at one of those same glittering events, perhaps a year after the stranger called Daniel Sir, that Rebecca first met Marcus Devlin. He was working the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed he belonged in every room he entered, and when his attention finally landed on Rebecca, it landed completely, the way a spotlight finds a single face in a crowd. He asked her questions, and then rarer still, he listened to her answers as though they were the most important words he had heard all night. To a woman who had spent years feeling invisible standing beside her own husband, that attention was intoxicating. Marcus made her feel interesting, desired, alive in a way she had nearly forgotten was possible. And though nothing improper happened that first night, something inside Rebecca quietly came loose, and it would never fully fasten again. Marcus Devlin was, in almost every visible way, the exact opposite of Daniel Whitaker, and that was precisely his appeal. He was a commercial real estate broker, polished and ambitious, a man who spoke fluently in the language of millions and wore his success where everyone could see it. He drove a car that cost more than the Whitaker house. He wore a watch that cost more than Daniel's truck. He talked about the towers rising across the Dallas skyline as though he were personally raising them, about deals on the horizon that would make his name, about a future with no ceiling on it at all. To Rebecca, starved for exactly this, Marcus was not a person so much as a promise, the living proof that the life she had always believed she deserved was real, and reachable, and standing right in front of her. The drift began the way these things almost always do, in small and deniable steps. A message here, an innocent question there, a lunch that was surely nothing more than two professionals talking. Marcus was careful, even clever, in how he pursued her. He never once spoke a word against Daniel, he did not have to. He simply held up, without ever naming it, the unbearable contrast between the man Rebecca had and the man she might choose. He praised her ambition, mourned that it had gone unmatched, marveled that a woman like her had settled for so little. And Rebecca, who had spent years being told by her own contentment-loving husband that they had enough, drank in every word like water in a drought. She told herself it was harmless. She told herself she was simply being seen. She told herself a great many things that were not true. For months, the affair lived only in Rebecca's imagination, which is in some ways the most dangerous place an affair can live. There, in her mind, she built an entire second life with Marcus, a life of glass towers and important dinners and a husband other women would envy. She compared that bright invented world to the quiet real one she went home to each night, and the real one lost, again and again, by a wider margin each time. She began to see Daniel not as a man but as an obstacle, the gray wall standing between her and the future she had already, in her heart, chosen. And once a person has made that choice inside themselves, the words to say it out loud are only a matter of time. Rebecca was no longer wondering whether to leave. She was only waiting for the courage, or perhaps the recklessness, to do it. The morning she finally found it was cold and gray, an ordinary winter Tuesday with nothing to mark it as the day a life would break in two. Daniel was at the kitchen table where he always was, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, reading by the low lamplight he preferred. Rebecca had rehearsed the words for weeks, sharpening them in private until they could not be misunderstood or talked away. And then she said them. She told him she was leaving. She told him she had given the best years of her life to a man who would never amount to anything, that she was tired of explaining him to her friends, tired of pretending that enough was the same thing as happiness. She told him there was a different life waiting for her, and a different kind of man who could give it to her. And through all of it, Daniel did not move. He simply listened, his face unreadable, his hands wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold. Rebecca, in her hurt and her momentum, said things she could not take back. She listed his failures one by one, every disappointment she had swallowed for 19 years rising up at once. She mocked his contentment, his truck, his diner, his locked little office and his quiet little life. She told him she pitied him, and worse, that she had pitied him for years. And Daniel took all of it in silence, the way a man stands in a hard rain he has long known was coming. When at last she ran out of words, breathless from the weight of everything she had finally set down, she waited for him to break. She was certain, after 19 years, that he would fight for her. He did not. Daniel set down his cold coffee, looked at her for a long, quiet moment with an expression she could not read, and said only 4 words. "If that's what you want." That was all. No argument. No bargaining. No desperate questions about what he had done wrong or how he might fix it. No tears. Just 4 quiet words and a stillness that, in her anger, Rebecca read as the final proof of everything she had ever believed about him, that he did not care enough, had never cared enough, to so much as raise his voice when his wife told him their marriage was over. She wanted a battle. She got a closing door. And she would spend the rest of her life misunderstanding why. Because it was not weakness that kept Daniel Whitaker calm that morning. It was recognition. He had seen this exact moment once before, decades earlier, written across the face of a woman who had vanished the instant his fortune looked thin. He had spent 19 years quietly praying he would never see it again, and now here it was, sitting at his own kitchen table, wearing the face of the wife he had finally, after so long, allowed himself to trust. He did not fight her because there was, in the end, nothing left to fight for. The test he had built his entire life around, the test he had desperately hoped she would never have to take, had just been failed in front of him, completely and without appeal. So he let her go. And after the door closed behind her, he sat alone for a long while, and then he made a single phone call she was never meant to hear. The divorce moved with a speed that surprised everyone but Daniel. He did not hire an aggressive attorney to bleed her or punish her. He did not contest a single thing she asked for. When the lawyers sat down to divide up the modest life the Whitakers appeared to own, the small house, the ordinary savings, the few plain cars, Daniel agreed to nearly all of it without complaint, letting Rebecca walk away with what looked, to the outside world, like a generous share of a small estate. She mistook his lack of resistance for guilt, and she told her friends as much. "He didn't even try," she said, with a bitterness that surprised even her. What she did not understand, what she could not have understood, was that the towers, the land, the $5 billion hidden behind the harmless name of Meridian, had never once entered the conversation. As far as the law was concerned, none of it had ever belonged to the marriage at all. There was one last piece of paper at the very end of it, slid quietly across a conference table by Daniel's lawyer, the same patient, unglamorous Walter Boyd who had been there at the beginning, 19 years before. It was a routine acknowledgement, he explained gently, simply confirming the terms that both parties had already agreed to. Rebecca signed it without truly reading it, exactly as she had signed those forgotten documents before her wedding, eager now to be finished, eager to begin the bright new life waiting for her. She even made a small joke as she did it, something light about how easy it was to divide up almost nothing. Walter Boyd, as he had done once before, did not laugh. He gathered the papers, thanked her politely, and slid them into a folder. And with that, it was done. Rebecca walked out of the courthouse into the cold bright afternoon, free at last. She had 11 days. 11 days. It does not sound like much, measured against 19 years. But everything that mattered in this story happened inside that narrow window, and to understand how completely Rebecca's life turned over in it, you have to watch both halves of it at once, the bright, careless days she was living, and the quiet, deliberate ones Daniel was living just across the city. Two people who had shared a bed for nearly 2 decades now moved through the same 11 days as strangers, each unaware of what the other was doing, each drawing closer to a collision that neither of them could yet see. Rebecca counted the days as the beginning of a new life. Daniel, though she did not know it, was counting them too, and arranging, in his careful and unhurried way, the things that would meet her at the end of them. Across the city, Daniel's days looked very different from hers. The light in the locked office burned late into each night. Walter Boyd's car appeared in the drive more than once. Phone calls were made in a low register of quiet command that Rebecca had heard only in glimpses across the years. Decisions that had waited, patiently, for the right moment were now being set in motion, among them a single decision about a single lease, requested by an ambitious young broker named Marcus Devlin, that would in time bring a great deal of glittering ambition crashing down. Daniel said nothing to anyone about his marriage. He simply did what he had always done in the hardest seasons of his life. He went quiet, and he went to work, and he let the careful machinery of an empire no one could see begin, slowly, to turn. Marcus Devlin, for his part, spent those same 11 days consumed by the deal of his lifetime. He barely noticed how little he saw of Rebecca. His mind was entirely on the downtown development that would make his name, and on the one obstacle that stood between him and everything he wanted, the approval of a faceless company called Meridian Holdings. He chased that approval with everything he had, working contacts, calling lawyers, trying every door, and finding every one of them politely closed. He told Rebecca it was nothing, just the ordinary friction of a big deal. He told himself the same. He did not know that the ghost he was chasing knew his name, knew his face, and knew exactly who he had taken to bed. He did not know that the decision he was so desperate for had, in truth, already been made. While Daniel worked in silence, Rebecca knew nothing of any of it, and she would not have cared if she had. To her, the man across the city was finished business, a closed chapter, a mistake at last corrected. Her attention was fixed entirely forward, on the gleaming new life she was certain was about to begin. And so, as Daniel quietly arranged the pieces of an ending she could not imagine, Rebecca threw herself into her bright new days without a single backward glance. She spent the first of those days happier than she had been in years. She moved into a sleek apartment that Marcus had helped her find, filled it with new things, and let herself believe that the hardest part was finally behind her. Marcus, for his part, was distracted in those days, consumed, he said, by the deal of his entire lifetime, a massive downtown development so large it would set him up for good and put his name, at last, among the important ones. Rebecca did not mind his distraction. She liked seeing him hungry. She liked that his world was full of glass towers and powerful names, the very world she had spent her whole life trying to enter. And so when Marcus asked her to come along to a crucial meeting at the offices of his biggest potential client, in the tallest building in the city, she did not hesitate. To her, it felt like an arrival. It was, instead, the beginning of the end of every illusion she had. In the days leading up to that meeting, the strange signs began again, louder now than they had ever been, though Rebecca still did not know how to read them. Marcus spoke constantly of a company called Meridian Holdings, the owner of the land his entire deal depended upon, and he spoke of it with a peculiar mixture of hunger and fear. No one, he complained, had ever actually met the person who controlled it. Every email arrived through layers of lawyers. Every decision came down from a single unseen owner whose approval could make Marcus rich beyond his dreams or break him completely. Rebecca, only half listening, found the name oddly, naggingly familiar, though she could not say from where. She also began to notice, the way you notice a word the moment someone points it out, that her ex-husband's surname kept appearing in unexpected places around the city. It was on a hospital wing first, a gleaming new children's wing, with the name Whitaker carved discreetly above the entrance. Then a scholarship fund she saw mentioned in the paper, the Whitaker Scholarship, quietly putting local kids through college. Then a charitable foundation, the same name again. A coincidence, surely, Rebecca told herself each time. Whitaker was hardly a rare name in Texas. There must be some other family entirely, some wealthy clan of Whitakers with no connection at all to the quiet, broke man she had just divorced. The truth was sitting directly in front of her, spelled out in stone and ink across the entire city, and her mind, faithful to the story she had always told about her own small life, simply refused to read it. She had spent 19 years choosing to forget. She was not about to stop now, 11 days from the truth. Still, even a mind as practiced at forgetting as Rebecca's has its limits, and somewhere in those days a small, stubborn curiosity finally stirred. Late one night, alone in the new apartment, she found herself typing the words Meridian Holdings into her phone, half out of idle interest, half out of something she could not name. The results were thin, deliberately so, a bare corporate page, a few passing mentions in business journals, no photographs, no names, nothing but the faint outline of a company that clearly did not wish to be looked at too closely. She stared at the screen for a long while. Then she typed a second search, the one her mind had been circling without admitting it. She typed the name Whitaker, and the word she had carried for 19 years filled the screen with results she was not at all prepared to see. And here is where the truth nearly reached her, and where, instead, she rescued herself from it. Among the results was a wealthy Texas real estate family, the kind of prominent dynasty that has its name on charity galas and society pages, a family of Whitakers, plural, old money and well documented. Rebecca seized on them with a relief so immediate it should have warned her. Of course. This was the wealthy Whitaker family she had vaguely heard of, the one behind the hospital wing and the scholarship and the foundation. It had nothing to do with her quiet, broke ex-husband, who simply happened to share their common surname. The coincidence that had unsettled her for days dissolved, in an instant, into something comfortable and explainable. She set the phone down, oddly soothed, and went to sleep certain she had solved a mystery that was not, in fact, a mystery at all. But the relief did not last, because relief built on a lie rarely does. Over the following days, small inconsistencies began to nag at her, the way a stone in a shoe nags at a walker who keeps insisting the path is smooth. The wealthy Whitaker dynasty she had found online, when she looked more closely, seemed to have nothing to do with Meridian Holdings at all. Their fortunes were in oil and cattle, not in the towers Marcus chased. And the more Marcus talked about the unseen owner of Meridian, a single man, intensely private, almost obsessively hidden, the less that man sounded like a sprawling, well-photographed dynasty, and the more he sounded like exactly one person Rebecca knew. She pushed the thought away each time it surfaced. It was too absurd to hold. And yet it kept surfacing, again and again, like something that refused to stay buried. Marcus, meanwhile, was losing his patience and, slowly, his confidence. He had thrown every resource he had at understanding Meridian Holdings, and every avenue led to the same dead end. Still, the unease would not fully leave her, no matter how firmly she explained it away. In the quiet moments it kept whispering the same impossible sentence she could not bear to hear. She found herself studying Marcus when he spoke of Meridian's owner, listening for details, half dreading that one of them would fit a man she knew too well. She told herself, again and again, that it was the wealthy dynasty, that it was coincidence, that it was nothing at all. But coincidence had begun to feel like a coat that no longer fit, and somewhere beneath all her careful explanations, Rebecca had begun, against her own will, to be afraid of what she might learn. The signs grew impossible to ignore, and still she ignored them. At a small gathering Marcus brought her to, the same distinguished older gentleman who had once crossed a crowded room to call Daniel Sir appeared again, now revealed to be a sitting state senator. And he was speaking, in hushed and respectful tones to a circle of powerful men, about the owner of Meridian Holdings. He called him one of the most important and most private men in all of Texas, a man who had quietly shaped half the city without ever once seeking credit or recognition for any of it. Rebecca felt a cold ripple of something she could not name move through her, a half-memory she could not catch. She told herself it was nothing. That same week, she overheard Marcus on the phone in the next room, his voice tight and high with panic, and what she heard should have ended her uncertainty for good. The entire deal, Marcus was saying, the deal that would define his life, lived or died on a single lease approval, and that approval rested entirely in the hands of the unseen owner of Meridian Holdings. He had never met the man. He had never even seen his face. He did not know his name. He only knew that everything he had worked his whole career for now depended on impressing a ghost. Rebecca listened from the other room, her heart beating strangely, and still, even then, she did not let herself connect the pieces that were lying right there in front of her. The name on the hospital wing. The name on the scholarship. The senator's reverence. The faceless owner of an empire. And the husband she had thrown away, with his locked office and his quiet phone calls and the stranger who had called him sir. She was, perhaps, the only person in the city who could not yet see it. The meeting was set for a Tuesday, in the lobby of the new flagship tower, the tallest building in all of Dallas. Rebecca dressed with enormous care that morning, the way she always had for the life she wanted to live, and she walked in beside Marcus with her chin held high and her heart full of arrival. Her heels echoed across the vast marble floor. The ceiling rose far above her, all glass and steel and quiet, immense wealth. This was the world she had reached for her whole life, and for one perfect, suspended moment, she felt as though she finally, truly belonged to it. And then she lifted her eyes toward the wall above the front desk. And the world she had spent 19 years chasing opened up in front of her at last, and then collapsed, completely, all at once. Carved into the stone, enormous and unmistakable, was a single word. A name. The same name she had carried for 19 years and signed away just 11 days earlier. The same name on the children's hospital wing, on the scholarship, on the foundation. Whitaker. Rebecca stood frozen on the marble floor while every coincidence she had ever chosen to forget came rushing back at once, all of them arriving together, more than her mind could hold. The locked office. The quiet phone calls. The stranger who called him sir. The bank manager's deference. In the mornings he disappeared and returned calm. The diner where they had met. Piece after piece after piece, slotting into a picture so vast and so obvious that she could not understand how she had failed to see it for 2 decades. And then, across the great lobby, the door, a man stepped out. He wore a simple, well-made suit instead of his familiar flannel, and his hair was combed a little differently, but Rebecca would have known that calm, unhurried walk anywhere on earth. It was Daniel. Her name is Daniel. The man in the dented pickup truck. The man who ate the same eggs at the same diner every single morning of his life. The man she had pitied and apologized for and finally, triumphantly, thrown away. He was the owner of Meridian Holdings. He was the unseen ghost Marcus had chased for years. He was the most important man in the lobby, in the building, perhaps in the entire city. Beside her, Marcus straightened and beamed, oblivious, ready at last to meet the powerful client who would make his career. And Daniel Whitaker, crossing the marble toward them, looked past Marcus entirely, and met his ex-wife's eyes. To truly grasp the scale of what Rebecca was seeing in that moment, you have to understand what Meridian Holdings actually was. It was not one tower. There were dozens. It was office buildings and shopping centers and entire city blocks that Daniel had bought quietly, patiently, over 30 years, often through a chain of other companies that led back to him only if you knew exactly where to look, and almost no one did. It was vast banks of undeveloped land spread across 3 states, bought cheap and held with the patience of a man who measured time in decades rather than quarters. It was a fortune that the handful of people who knew the truth estimated, conservatively and in lowered voices, at $5 billion. The quiet man who had let his wife believe they could not afford a lake house owned, it turned out, a meaningful share of the very skyline that hung above that lake. And as she stood there, every memory of her marriage began to rearrange itself in front of her. The old pickup truck had never been a sign of poverty at all, it was simply a thing Daniel loved and saw no reason to give up. The diner where they had met, with its worn booths and its friendly cook, had belonged to Daniel the whole time, one small holding in an empire she had eaten breakfast inside of, unknowing, for 19 years. The locked office at the back of the house, the one room she had been forbidden to enter, had been the quiet command center of a $5 billion fortune the entire time she slept just down the hall. Every low conversation with Walter Boyd. Every stranger who called him sir. Every morning he vanished and returned at peace. Every clue had been the truth, patiently reaching for her. And she had refused, again and again and again, to take its hand. But the question that struck Rebecca hardest, standing frozen in that marble lobby, was not what Daniel was worth. It was why. Why had he done it? Why had he let her believe, for 19 long years, that they were barely getting by? Why had he stood silent while she apologized for him to her friends, while she counted other people's lake houses, while she lay awake night after night doing the math on a life that had never actually been small at all? Why had he handed her the divorce without a fight, let her walk away believing she had taken a fair share of nothing, when a single sentence could have stopped her in her tracks? The answers to those questions would prove to be the saddest part of this entire story, and they lived in the mind of the one man who had known the whole truth from the beginning, the quiet lawyer named Walter Boyd. Walter had been there from the very start, and it was Walter who, in the difficult weeks that followed, finally explained it. Daniel had not hidden his fortune to deceive Rebecca, not in the cruel way she first imagined. He had hidden it because of the woman who had abandoned him decades earlier, the one who had vanished the moment his money looked thin. That betrayal had carved a single unbreakable rule into Daniel for the rest of his life, the rule that governed everything he did. He would never again let anyone love his money instead of him. So he had made himself invisible. He had built his entire empire behind the harmless name of Meridian, and he had made a quiet, private vow that the only people who would ever learn the truth were the ones who proved, over years, that they loved the simple man first. It was not a trap, Walter insisted, his voice heavy. It was a test. And for 19 years, Rebecca had been passing it. Walter Boyd, who had known Daniel longer than anyone, did not pretend the test had been entirely fair. He had told Daniel as much, more than once, over the years. A person cannot be expected to pass a test they do not know they are taking, Walter had argued. A love built on a hidden condition is a love placed, unknowing, on a trapdoor. Daniel had never really disagreed. He had simply been unable to do otherwise. The wound from his youth had cut too deep, and the fear it left behind was stronger than any argument, even his own. And so he had gone on testing, gone on hiding, gone on protecting himself from a betrayal that had already happened decades before, until the protection itself became the very thing that cost him the love he had finally allowed himself to want. It was, Walter would say quietly, the saddest case of self-protection he had ever seen in his life. That was the cruelest detail of all. For 19 years, Daniel had watched his wife and seen, again and again, the very proof he had spent his whole damaged life searching for. She had married a man with seemingly nothing. She had stayed through what looked like lean years. She had loved him, or so it had appeared, when his pockets were empty and his truck was old and his life was small. And so Daniel had slowly, cautiously, after decades of guarding his heart, begun to believe. He had started to let himself think that he had found the impossible thing, the one person in all the world who loved him for himself, the one person he could finally bring inside the locked room and show everything. According to Walter, in the very months before the divorce, Daniel had made a decision he had never once believed himself capable of making. He had decided to tell her everything. He had even begun, quietly, to prepare for it. Walter described how Daniel had spent those final weeks arranging things with unusual care, planning the moment when he would at last reveal who he really was, and lay out the extraordinary life the two of them could finally live in the open after so many years of pretending. He had no idea, as he made those tender plans, that his wife was already gone in her heart, that she was lying awake beside him imagining a future with another man. And so the two of them moved toward the same season from opposite directions. Daniel was walking toward the truth, carrying it like a gift. Rebecca was walking toward the door. He was building a revelation. She was building an escape. And she reached the door first, by the narrowest of margins, 11 days, and never knew how close she had come to receiving everything instead. But the final cost of those 11 days had not yet come due. When the shock of the lobby finally wore off, what rose in Rebecca's place was not regret. It was calculation. She had been married to this man for 19 years, and now she knew he was worth $5 billion. Surely, she reasoned, some part of that fortune was rightfully hers. She found herself a sharp and expensive attorney, the kind of lawyer who advertised himself as a slayer of rich men, and she moved to reopen the divorce, claiming her rightful share of the marital estate she had never known existed. Her new lawyer was confident, even eager. 19 years of marriage. A fortune of that staggering size. Surely no court in the country would let a man hide billions of dollars from his own wife and walk away clean. The case Rebecca's lawyer intended to build was, on its surface, a powerful one. 19 years of marriage, he argued, was not nothing. A wife who had stood beside a man for 2 decades, who had kept his home and shared his name and supported, in her way, the quiet life from which his fortune had grown, surely such a wife was owed a share, prenuptial paperwork or not. He spoke of hidden assets and concealment, of a husband who had deceived his own spouse about the very foundation of their life together. He spoke of fairness, of decency, of what a jury of ordinary people would feel in their gut when they heard that a billionaire had let his wife believe they were poor. It was, he assured Rebecca, exactly the kind of case that made careers. And for a time, Rebecca let herself believe every confident word of it. The story, perhaps inevitably, found its way into the press, and the press could not get enough of it. It had everything. A secret fortune. A quiet man in an old truck revealed as one of the richest men in Texas. A wife who had walked away just days before learning the truth. The headlines wrote themselves, and for a few strange weeks Rebecca found herself a minor public figure, recognized in restaurants, the subject of opinions from strangers who knew nothing of her life. Some pitied her. Many did not. The comment sections filled with people arguing about whether she was a victim of cruel deception or simply a woman reaping what she had sown. Rebecca read more of it than was good for her, and each piece, whether kind or cruel, only deepened her certainty that she was owed something for all she was suddenly going through. Daniel, characteristically, said nothing. He gave no interviews, issued no statements, made no attempt to defend himself in the court of public opinion that had so eagerly taken up his story. While the headlines roared, he ate his eggs at the same diner, drove the same truck, and let his lawyers do their patient work behind closed doors. To those who did not know him, the silence looked like guilt, or perhaps like arrogance. To the few who did, it looked like exactly what it was, a man who had spent his entire life refusing to be moved by the opinions of people who did not matter to him, and who saw no reason at all to begin now. He had built the walls around his fortune long ago, brick by careful brick. He did not need to shout. He only needed to wait. In the early skirmishes of the case, Rebecca's side won small victories, and each one fed her hope. A motion granted here, a document compelled there, a judge who seemed willing to let the matter proceed rather than dismiss it outright. Her lawyer grew steadily more confident, and his confidence was contagious. Rebecca began, once more, to imagine the future the money would buy, began, in the privacy of her own mind, to spend a fortune she did not yet have. She allowed herself to believe that the law, in the end, would see exactly what she saw, a wronged wife and a deceptive husband, and a balance that badly needed correcting. She did not understand that the early skirmishes had never been the real battle. She did not understand what was waiting, patient and unhurried, in a quiet lawyer's folder. There was even a moment, midway through the proceedings, when Rebecca believed she had already won. A preliminary ruling went her way on a technical point, and her lawyer called her that evening, elated, telling her that the other side would surely now look to settle rather than risk a public trial. Rebecca celebrated quietly, allowing herself the first real joy she had felt since the lobby. She pictured the call that would come, the number that would be offered, the apology she imagined was owed to her. She began, almost, to feel vindicated, as though the universe were finally correcting the great injustice of her life. The offer to settle never came. Across the city, in a quiet office, Walter Boyd read the same ruling, set it aside, and returned, unbothered, to the documents in the folder. He was in no hurry at all. If Rebecca had been paying closer attention, the behavior of Daniel's side might have unsettled her. Walter Boyd and his team never seemed worried. They did not fight the small motions with any real urgency. They produced what was asked of them without complaint, agreed to dates without resistance, and moved through the proceedings with a calm that bordered on serene. An experienced eye would have recognized that calm for what it was, the unconcern of a side that already holds the winning card and is simply waiting for the right moment to lay it down. But Rebecca, swept up in her lawyer's confidence and her own growing hope, mistook their composure for weakness, just as she had once mistaken Daniel's silence at the kitchen table for the very same thing. She was about to learn, a second time, how badly she had misread a quiet man's calm. For a few heady weeks, Rebecca allowed herself to believe that her mistake could be undone, that she might yet walk away with a piece of the empire after all. And then the folder came out. It happened in a deposition, in a cold conference room very much like the one where she had once joked about dividing up nothing. Daniel's lawyers, led by the patient and unhurried Walter Boyd, did not argue or raise their voices or grandstand. They simply produced two documents and laid them gently on the polished table, side by side. The first was a prenuptial agreement, signed by Rebecca herself 19 years earlier, in which she had agreed, in plain and unmistakable language, that any and all assets held by Daniel's separate trusts and companies, including, named directly in the document, Meridian Holdings, would remain his and his alone, no matter what should ever happen to the marriage. The second was the acknowledgment she had signed at the divorce itself, confirming all over again that she had received everything she was legally entitled to. The fortune had been walled off before the marriage even began. And Rebecca had personally signed away her claim to it. Twice. Laughing both times. Her lawyer's confidence drained from the room like water from a cracked glass. There was no case. There had never been a case. The empire was not marital property and never had been. It had been carefully, legally, deliberately walled off decades before Rebecca ever signed the marriage license, and she herself had agreed to that wall, in writing, twice, while joking each time that there was surely nothing worth protecting. Across the table, Daniel said very little. When at last he was asked to speak, he did so quietly, without anger and without any trace of triumph. He confirmed the facts. He confirmed that everything had been fully and properly disclosed, in writing, all those years before. And then he fell silent. He did not gloat. He did not list her cruelties back to her, though he could have recited every one. He simply sat there, a billionaire in a plain dark suit, and let the truth do the only thing the truth ever needs to do. Rebecca walked out of that building with nothing more than what she had already taken, the modest share of a modest life she had once been so very eager to claim. But the day was not finished with her yet. On the courthouse steps, in the cold bright afternoon, her phone began to ring, and the news on the other end of it was the final blow she never saw coming. Marcus Devlin's great deal, the one that was going to set him up for life and make his name at last, had collapsed entirely. The crucial lease, the one that lived or died on the approval of Meridian's unseen owner, had quietly and finally been denied. The man Marcus had spent his whole career trying to impress, the ghost he had at last met face to face in that marble lobby, had simply declined to do business with him. Daniel had known exactly who Marcus Devlin was the entire time. And with one quiet decision, made without a single word of anger, he had ended him. What happened next was the oldest story in the world, and the cruelest mirror in this one. The moment Marcus Devlin's fortune turned to ash, the moment his great deal died and his money dried up and his future closed, he disappeared from Rebecca's life almost overnight, vanishing in exactly the same way a woman had once vanished from Daniel's, decades before, when his own money had looked thin. Marcus had never truly loved Rebecca. He had loved the rising version of his own life, the one in which everything was climbing, and the instant it began to fall he saw her only as weight he no longer cared to carry. Rebecca, who had left a faithful man for a charming one, now learned in the most personal and humiliating way possible the very lesson Daniel had learned in his 20s. She had become the woman who leaves at the first sign of empty pockets, and then, in the same cruel season, the woman who is left for exactly the same reason. But there was one final detail, one last truth that Rebecca would not learn until much later, and it was the one that would stay with her, quietly, for the rest of her life. In the weeks after the divorce, when Daniel at last moved the final few things out of the old house, a folder was found in the locked office, sitting alone in the center of the desk, dated the very week she had filed for divorce. Across the front of it, written in Daniel's own careful, deliberate hand, were 3 words. Our next chapter. Inside were 2 open-ended plane tickets to a place Rebecca had once mentioned, long ago, that she had always dreamed of seeing. There was the deed to a quiet ranch, placed entirely in Rebecca's name. And there was a handwritten letter, several pages long, that began with a single line. By the time you read this, you'll know everything. I should have told you years ago. He had been days away from laying the whole world at her feet. She had walked out 11 days too soon. And so we arrive at the question that has no easy answer, the question this entire story was always quietly leading toward. Was justice served? On one hand, there is Rebecca, who had everything she truly needed and threw it away chasing a brighter life she had only imagined, and what came back to her in the end was nothing more than the natural consequence of her own choices. On the other hand, there is Daniel, a man who loved his wife so deeply, and trusted the world so little, that he built a test no one was ever told they were taking, and then lost the woman he loved for failing it by a margin of days. Was he a good man, wronged by a wife who valued money over the heart beating beneath the flannel? Or was he a wounded one, who hid the truth for so long that he made the very ending he feared most almost impossible to avoid? Perhaps, in the end, both things are true at once. Today, the 2 of them live in the same wide city, separated by a distance that has nothing at all to do with miles. Daniel Whitaker still drives that dented old pickup truck. He still eats the same breakfast, in the same worn booth, in the same small diner he has quietly owned for 30 years. He still wears the same few plain jackets, still says little, still moves through the world as the unremarkable man almost no one ever recognized. He gives away enormous sums of money without ever once attaching his name where anyone would think to look for it. And among the things he now quietly funds, almost without comment, is a row of rebuilt homes and a new community center, in the very neighborhood where Rebecca herself grew up, the poor streets she had spent her whole life trying to escape. He never speaks of her. He simply goes on being the man he always was, the man she could never quite manage to see. And somewhere across that same enormous skyline, Rebecca watches his towers rise. Each new one that climbs into the Texas sky is a reminder of the cold March morning she signed her name across a piece of paper and called it freedom. She got, in the end, exactly the small life she had always feared, not because the world forced it upon her, but because she had held the other life in her own 2 hands, for 19 years, and never once recognized what it was. She had been married to a man worth $5 billion, a man who was, in those final weeks, planning to give all of it to her, and she had traded him for a charming stranger and a name carved in marble she could no longer claim. The most expensive mistake of her life had not been made in a courtroom. It had been made, quietly, at a kitchen table, 11 days too soon. She learned of the folder, in the end, the way she had learned everything else in this story, too late to do anything but grieve it. Some months after the case was over, a small package arrived. Inside was the deed to the ranch, still in her name, which Daniel had never undone, along with a copy of the letter that began with the line she would never forget. By the time you read this, you'll know everything. I should have told you years ago. There was no note attached, no message from Daniel himself, no explanation. Walter Boyd had simply, quietly, sent her the thing his client had once meant to give her, perhaps out of some private sense that she ought to know what had truly been waiting at the end of those 11 days. Rebecca read the letter alone, more than once, and then she put it away where she would not have to see it, and where she would never quite be able to forget that it existed. She saw Daniel only once more, and from a distance. It was at a charity event, the kind she still attended out of habit, the kind where she had once laughed off a stranger calling her husband sir. She looked up, and there he was across the crowded room, in a plain suit, listening to someone with that same patient attention she remembered from the diner all those years ago. For a moment their eyes met. He did not glare, did not soften, did not cross the room. He simply looked at her, the way one looks at a place one used to live, and then he turned, kindly and completely, back to the conversation in front of him. Rebecca understood, in that single look, that there was no door left to knock on. The man she had thrown away was not angry with her. He had simply, at last, let her go. And that, perhaps, was the hardest thing of all to carry. Not the lost fortune, not the towers she would never share in, not even the public humiliation of the case. It was the quiet, settled peace on the face of a man who no longer needed anything from her, who had grieved their marriage in private and moved on without bitterness, and who was, by every account, content. Rebecca had spent 19 years believing she had married a man who would never amount to anything. She would spend the rest of her life knowing she had been married to one of the most remarkable men she would ever meet, and that she had looked at him every single day, across every breakfast, and somehow never seen him at all. That knowledge does not fade. It simply settles, and you learn to live beneath its weight. The years that followed were not kind to Rebecca, though they were not catastrophic either. She did not fall into ruin, she simply settled into a smaller, quieter life than the one she had imagined for herself, a life shadowed always by the knowledge of what might have been. She worked, she aged, she watched from a distance as the Whitaker name climbed higher across the skyline. Now and then someone would recognize her, the woman from the story, and she would see in their eyes the question they were too polite to ask. How could you not have known? She had no answer for them. She had asked it of herself 10,000 times. The truth, the only truth she ever arrived at, was the simplest and the most painful one of all. She had not known because she had never truly looked. So before you go, let us know in the comments what you truly believe. Was Daniel Whitaker a good man who was finally proven right, or did he build a test that love was never meant to survive in the first place? Would you have seen through the old truck and the worn boots and the quiet smile, or would you, like Rebecca, have spent 19 years sitting across the breakfast table from a fortune and never once recognized it for what it was? Tell us your honest answer down below, because we read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about what the people in your own life are truly worth, far beyond the size of their bank account, then do us one small favor and subscribe, so you never miss the next true story we tell. Because the next one, we promise you, is every bit as unforgettable as this one. Until then, take care of the ones who love you when your pockets are empty. They are worth more than every tower in the sky.